Ben, all right. Excited to talk to you today, Ben. I've learned a lot about you recently, but I think for the viewers out there that want to know more about you, who is Ben Bankoff?
I am a lifelong digital advertiser. Got my roots in paid search, brand paid search teams for about 10 years, and then jumped over to the programmatic, specifically the connected TV space, close to a decade ago. So I've been in the digital advertising game for way too long, frankly.
When you look back on the last 10 to 15 years you've been in this space, what have you seen as the biggest single shift throughout that period in either technology or how advertisers have viewed this medium? Can you see a single moment as a big shift, or is it just constant change?
I think it's a little bit of both. So constant change for sure. I think that's just the nature of all things digital, but particularly digital advertising. Um, I think some people might say like the introduction of programmatic and real-time bidding. I disagree with that to some degree, just because I think if you were to strip down really something as fundamental as like Google Ads or AdWords back in the day, like at the end of the day, that was one of the most original, DSPs that was just pointing at a single supply source, being Google, right? But in reality, it was still a unified auction where real-time bidding was taking place. So really, you could make the argument that programmatic's been around since like the mid 2000s. Um, to me, and maybe I'm a little biased because this is an area that we focus on a lot, but the introduction of connected TV and that shift from linear, both on a viewer and consumption standpoint, but also from an advertiser's perspective, that shift has been pretty dramatic. First eyeballs went over there, and then dollars always follow eyeballs. But relative to how long the linear TV, has existed, um, it's been a big shift in a very short period of time. And I think we just got the May numbers back from the Nielsen Gauge, and they said May was the first time that streaming total viewing time of streaming actually eclipsed the combined viewing time of broadcast and cable. I think that's just going to continue to accelerate.
Absolutely. And it is a fascinating thing to kind of watch the lag behind dollars and eyes and, depending on channel, and not only dollars from just like an advertising perspective, but from just like a comfort level. People don't like making big shifts on things, especially when it's worked for them in the past. So, I find that when I look at linear versus CTV, a lot of advertisers that were successful with linear are shifting a lot slower to CTV than the eyeballs are, just because of that comfort level. Is that something you see, in your day to day, or what do you tell advertisers when they're hesitant to make that switch?
Yeah, it's something we see all the time, right? Especially with businesses that have been around for, 20, 30 plus years. Yeah, I mean they got to where they are on the backbones of broadcast television than cable. But with that comes some degree of comfort and reluctance to change, right? I mean, again, we'll use personal injury lawyers as a great example, right? They built their firm into the firm that it is today, really riding the backbones of broadcast television for the last 30 years. So naturally there's going to be some hesitancy and reluctance to move away from that. But I think ultimately it just comes down to two things. One is education, and then with that comes trust, right? Trusting the people that are educating you on this thing, that they're being honest, and they're operating with integrity, and not selling you a bag of tricks or a bag of lies. But really, it's an education thing. It's explaining that the world of CTV is still the same thing of TV. It's just a different way of consuming it, and that it's incredibly important for your continued growth to be in the spot where people are actually watching the most television these days.
Absolutely. One thing I'm really interested in hearing your take on is I always try to draw parallels to the industry that we're in, because under the hood, it's incredibly complex with a ton of nuances and a million different endpoints and all of these crazy things. So I try to draw parallels like, hey, this is, an example of something else in a different industry where this happens. And one thing I've been thinking about recently is like you go on, let's just say one of the, if not the biggest e-commerce sites in the world with guaranteed 2-day shipping, and you look up something like a phone case, and there's 1,000 phone cases, and they all have a different brand name and maybe a slightly different design, but they're all being manufactured in the same place in, the same factory somewhere. And I see that a lot with CTV today, where so many firms are sprouting up left and right and, white labeling a service and coming up with some new trademark term. And it creates a lot of confusion and frustration for buyers because they don't know what's real or what's resold or who knows what. I would just ask, I know we share that opinion, but what do you say to those buyers? What's your best tip for navigating a world in which every CTV company just seems like another drop shipped item online?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it ultimately comes back to demanding transparency and operating and working with people that operate with integrity. Um, I was part of the go-to-market team of a very early stage CTV product back in 2016. And we kind of anticipated this was going to happen in terms of it just becoming a race to the bottom. And unfortunately, we've seen that absolutely play out. It's with that, it's created space for a lot of bad actors to enter. There's inherently a lot of murkiness within the world of programmatic. And then when bad actors see the amount of dollars flowing into this, it does create a window of opportunity. So navigating it is just about demanding transparency, working with reputable providers who are willing to answer tough questions, to get on phone calls with you right away when something pops up, and just demanding real world results too, right? It's very easy for operators in the space to claim all sorts of attribution, and I can talk at length as to why people should be very skeptical when they see a 10x ROI and hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars attributed back to CTV. You have to ultimately just look at incrementality, right? Since lighting up CTV, assuming all things remained equal, has your business grown, right? Did you sell more units this month before you went on with CTV? And you just have to look at it that way. Like, is your business growing? And if so, great. Then this thing's probably working. And it's up to us as the experts in the industry to figure out how we can refine things and continue to throw fuel, accelerate the growth. But as the advertiser, you got to look at real world business outcomes. Are things improving since lighting up a new channel? And if so, great, continue down that path.
Really interesting you say that, because on one hand, there is so much technology involved in the entire supply chain and programmatic that it can be very easy to get too into the weeds from a performance marketing standpoint and lose sight of what is tried and true over years and years of just true incrementality of, like, if I launch X campaign, do Y numbers go up? And I think in this race to the bottom, I see a race to dashboard and everyone's newest dashboard always popping up, and it's almost like they're just trying to make it shinier and shinier for you to forget about. You actually have a set of books for your business that tell you if revenue goes up and profit goes up and all of these things that we can't lose sight of, no matter how fancy a dashboard might be, right? Switching gears here a little bit, I want to lean on your experience in the past 10 to 15 years and ask what you think, whether it be a challenge that you've seen throughout the years or maybe even a new challenge, but what is the single biggest challenge you have seen or continue to see in programmatic and CTV?
Oh, overwhelmingly, it's ad fraud. Overwhelmingly. It's crazy to me, frankly, how quick this industry is to try to either completely ignore that problem and pretend that it doesn't exist, when at the same time, everybody in the industry is willing to acknowledge reports that come out stating that there's anywhere between 50 to $150 billion of ad fraud spent annually. And a lot of people like to think, well, it doesn't happen to us, or it's not, it's not in the US market. It's very simple. Like, look at ad spend by country relative to the amount of ad fraud taking place, and it would be impossible for the number to get to where it is if a lot of it wasn't spent in the US. I think if you look at it by country, like, the US is double the amount of ad spend compared to number two, and then like 8 to 10x number three. I mean, we outspend on an advertising basis far more. So for us to just pretend that problem isn't impacting any of our campaigns is absolutely ludicrous to me. And ultimately it comes down to just the economics of how this industry has worked for so long, right? Most, I would say most businesses in this industry operate off of a percent of media spend. So they are inherently incentivized to make sure that they are spending your budget in full so that they continue to get their full 15% margin or whatever it may be. And with that comes a willingness to look the other way. And until I think as an industry, we've really decided to clamp down and take this seriously, it's going to continue to plague the entire industry. And the reason I'm super passionate about it is that it disproportionately advertises the small and medium businesses that frankly don't have the budgets that can deal with any amount of waste, much less significant amounts of it. And it just creates more distrust in the entire digital advertising industry when you're running a campaign for someone that has a relatively small budget and 50% of it's going to fraud. So their real world outcomes are minimal to zero because you're wasting half of their budget. So it's in everybody's best interest that we work towards resolving this issue. And it's going to take pretty seismic changes across the board before we can get there.
Do you think that those changes to be effective in aggregate have to be legislated, or do you believe the private market can solve this problem as it stands today?
It's a great question. Considering how just unbelievably huge of a problem it is, just from a monetary standpoint now. Like I saw a report that said that if you just look at the revenue, it's I think the second largest criminal enterprise behind drug trafficking. So I mean, yeah, at some point it's like a legitimate national security concern. Um, it's also an incredibly technical space to try and legislate. So I don't know what the right answer to that is. I know what a more immediate step that would really move the needle would be is getting the publishing side of the space to really pay attention to this. I spent 2 years as the head of programmatic at a tier one publisher, and I know firsthand what this does to your bottom line and to your overall revenue. And for some reason, the largest publishers that control the majority of spend and impressions in this space, it's just not on their radar. And I think if we can get through to them the actual like direct impact to revenue this is having on you and your business, they'll force and demand change. And at the end of the day, like on the advertising side, the demand side, even the supply side, none of this exists without publishers, right? So they ultimately can control the narrative and control the direction of this. They just really need to get unified and take a stand and say, this is not happening anymore. We're reducing our supply paths to 3 people that we trust, or we're going directly to advertisers, or whatever that path looks like. They can really shape the direction of this industry for the positive. That I think is a more immediate step that could happen. The legislative side of things, like I said, that it's going to take a long time. It's going to be incredibly difficult for them to figure out how to do it, frankly. But again, given the just degree of fraud that's taking place, I mean, yeah, we may have gotten to that point where legislation does need to happen.
And I find it an interesting thought experiment because, I think at some level it has to happen in aggregate from a single, party, if you will, in the sense that if it's going to be the supply side, it has to be the group of publishers. If it's going to be legislative, it's got to be national where it's effective, to all markets. If it's and I think where it gets really tricky is if it's from the demand side, it has to be all of the demand partners. And these are fierce competitors that, are constantly working to one up the next guy. And no one, if someone were to develop a methodology to truly eliminate 100% of fraud, while some providers are more efficient than others, they're not going to share that with their competition because that's going to be a huge performance-based advantage for them from a results standpoint. Then you look at, if you say, let's pick the middle of your fraud numbers. Let's say it's 100 billion in ad fraud per year in aggregate. Well, if one provider truly comes up with that way to solve for all of their ad fraud, that their percentage of ad fraud now gets dispersed among all other providers and their ratios go up. So it's not like individual parties solving for it reduces the overall amount of ad fraud. It will just go to the next guy who hasn't figured it out, which again is a huge competitive advantage for that demand side partner who figures it out. And if the other guy is now probably making a bigger margin because they're buying higher rates of ad fraud, which is typically cheaper, they're not going to complain either. So to me, it just looks like this mess. And to your point earlier, it's why we at Aduro and why we also recommend you need to be so focused on real world outcomes, because no matter what a dashboard says, no matter what your provider says, if your business outcomes aren't getting better, then that provider isn't doing their job. And I would be really concerned with where your ad dollars are actually going.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And to your earlier point, it's gonna take, yeah, a unified front here to really make any of this happen. And also to tie it back to operating with integrity. Like if somebody does truly find the silver bullet that can overnight just make it go away, then yeah, I mean, from a business lens, I would understand the desire to keep that internally and make it proprietary to you. But just for the broader ecosystem, and again, all of the actual businesses who fund all of the advertising industry, like it's better for everybody for this to happen. And I don't think anybody is going to overnight come up with the silver bullet, but I think that there are, industry standards that can be set that could greatly, inhibit the ability for at least the level of fraud to take place if these standards were just, developed and then actually enforced.
Yeah.
That's a big problem that we see in this industry as well, is that, somebody like the IAB or, the ORTB Council, like they'll come up with the new protocols or new standards, but they don't actually have any way of enforcing them. And I don't know what that looks like. I'm kind of just spitballing right now, but if everybody adopted, all the publishers and all of the supply paths, everybody adopted all of the recommended specs of, ORTB 2.6, there'd be a lot more transparency in this industry and a lot less room for bad actors because there's not as much murkiness anymore. But unfortunately, there's just not, there's no way to enforce that. We can set recommendations and encourage people to adopt these, but at the end of the day, you can't force their hand.
I think this industry needs a Volvo. And what I mean by that is I think it was in the 40s or 50s. My timeline could be way off, but Volvo developed the seatbelt and they intentionally did not patent it because they knew it made people so much safer. And they wanted every manufacturer to be able to use it and keep people safe, even though it obviously could have changed their business, forever. And they're still a successful brand, but to your point, they can always go back and claim that, hey, that's what makes us who we are as a company. We want what's better for the ecosystem, for people, for real people, not always the bottom line, right? And with all that being said, we've had a really, really great conversation here today. I'm going to ask you one last question, a little more lighthearted, not talking about all the fraud and the foreign actors that are ripping off small businesses to fund, terrorist cells around the country and all that really, really just lighthearted stuff. I know you've recently picked up fishing and you've caught a few really good ones out there. I'm going to make you fish for an answer. What is the biggest difference between fishing and advertising technology?
The biggest difference between the two. Patience. Fishing requires a lot more patience. The ad tech industry is not only instantaneous, but you can reach out to people and demand things right away from a technical standpoint, as well as, we get very into the weeds. And when we identify something that looks suspicious or anomalous, we're solving that today, or at least we're going to start the conversation to get it solved today. Fishing doesn't work that way. I can't just demand from the fish that it bite my line and I get to bring it in. Unfortunately, it's a lot more being patient.
To that point, would that make fishing more exciting if you could do that, or would that ruin the whole point of fishing?
And ruin the entire thing.
Right.
Yeah, it ruined the entire thing. It's good to be patient. It's good to learn that.
It's good to be patient. Well, Ben, it was a great conversation with you today. We all learned a lot, and I look forward to the next time we get together. And good luck casting those reels. Next time I come through, I'll get a line out there with you.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for the conversation, Brandon. It was fun.
Take care. Bye-bye.